Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the important themes running throughout Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity is how we should evaluate violence understood in a number of different ways, sometimes very literally, sometimes in an extended manner in what she calls situations of oppression. And we could say that it reaches a kind of crux in the very last section of the third part of the Ethics of Ambiguity, which is titled Ambiguity. And I wanted to begin with one particular passage, which occurs about halfway through the discussion, that I think helps us. It doesn't resolve things entirely, but it gives you a good sense about what her stance is. So she says, we challenge every condemnation as well as every a priori justification of the violence practiced with a view to a valid end. So let's start at the very end of that. So she's not talking about all violence per se. It is possible to condemn violence that has no valid end. For example, just pure sadism. We don't have to say, well, we can't really judge. We need to look at each situation individually. No, in some cases we can say that person's just a bastard and they want to hurt other people and they get off on that. And, that is a use of their freedom, yes, but we don't have to ratify that. We're talking about where there's some sort of valid end, at least, appearing valid, not just to the person who's doing it, but potentially to other people. So coming back to the part of it, challenging, right? It's not saying we condemn every condemnation as well as justification. It's saying we challenge it. We're going to call it out. We're going to say, yeah, are you sure about that? What about this issue over here? Which means that nothing is easily and once and for all decided. It's a continual process. And this is what frustrates a lot of people about existentialism. She talks about, one intellectual of her time saying that the Marxists are the real heroes and we should put aside the existentialists because they're always going back and forth about stuff. And she's saying, no, we do need to go back and forth about stuff. So what is she challenging? Or saying that existentialists challenge every condemnation as well as justification a priori. So it's not that you can't justify or condemn, but you can't do it simply on the basis of something that you're bringing to the situation and saying, we all agree on this, or the only reasonable way to see it is this. You actually have to make a case for the violence that you want to condemn or justify. So she is going to consider a number of different, let's call them permutations on this, that are modes of violence writ large. So the first one that she talks about in this section, she says, if I find myself in a position to do violence to a child or to a melancholic, we would say depressed, sick or distraught person, the reason is that I also find myself charged with his upbringing, his happiness, and his health. I am a parent, a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, or a friend. So by a tacit agreement, by the fact that I'm solicited, the strictness of my decision is accepted or even desired. The more seriously I accept my responsibilities, the more justified it is. This is why love authorizes severities which are not granted to indifference. So you might say, okay, so you're in charge of somebody who is a child, not capable of, really seeing through decisions on their own, a little bit too prone to following their passions, their emotions, not fully developed, or somebody who's sick, somebody who's in the grips of some mental illness, right? Maybe addiction. Can we use violence for their sake on them? And the answer is, well, sometimes yes. But it has to be, pretty careful. And she says this is a complex problem, right? We must not make that person an accomplice of that flight from freedom that is found in heedlessness, caprice, mania, and passion. On the other hand, they are free beings, and we have to find some way to respect that. We can't simply, like she says, prohibit a person from error, right? That is to forbid them to fulfill their own existence. And so, we have to be quite careful with this. And she says, we object to inquisitors who want to create faith and virtue from without. We have to help the person to realize what that would be. And so she talks about this. She says, violence is not immediately justified. So see, there's not automatically a priori justification when it opposes willful acts by the part of the person which one considers perverted. It becomes inadmissible, she says, if it uses the pretext of ignorance to deny a freedom which can be practiced within ignorance itself. And she's going to use this term enlightened elites a number of times here. And she says, let the enlightened elites strive to change the situation of the child, the illiterate, the primitive, crushed beneath superstitions. That's one of the most urgent tasks, but they must respect a freedom, which like theirs is absolute. So there's a lot of people who are always like, these people are not as capable as us. And she says, if you're going to make having complete knowledge of things the criteria for getting to make your own decisions, you're very far from that too, you enlightened elites. You're not better off, except marginally, than the child, the person who suffers from ignorance. And, she's got an interesting thing here, a little digression about the French and governance and all that we're going to skip over here. But she's going to talk about childhood being a normal but transitory situation, something that she talked about much earlier in the work. She says, the enlightened elite objects, you don't let a child dispose of themselves. They don't get to vote. And she says, to the extent that woman or the happy or resigned slave lives in an infantile world of ready-made values, calling them an eternal child or grown-up child has some meaning, but the analogy is only partial. Childhood is a particular sort of situation, a natural situation whose limits are not created by other human beings and which is not comparable to a situation of oppression. It's a situation which is common to all of us and temporary for all. So it doesn't represent a limit which cuts the individual off from his possibilities, but it's the moment of development in which new possibilities are won. So, we should sometimes structure a child's life so that they're going to develop, but we can't keep them in perpetual childhood, right? So what about another kind of situation? She talks about an individual who is living in a situation of falsehood, and that falsehood is violence and tyranny. Shall I tell the truth in order to free the victim? Now, she doesn't say, yes, automatically. It's always good to tell the truth to free the victim. She says, well, there's something to consider here. She says it would be necessary first to create a situation of such a kind that the truth might be bearable. There are certain truths that in the situation that the person is currently in would be absolutely devastating. They could be enabled to deal with that truth, but you've got to do some work. So we can't say yes or no, condemn or justify automatically. We have to look at the situation. And then she goes on and says that through losing his illusions, the deluded individual might again find about him reasons for hoping, right? And she gives us a great example of this. So imagine a married couple who persist in living in a hovel, in a slum, in some really crappy environment. If you don't succeed in giving them the desire to live in a more healthful dwelling, well, let them follow their preferences. But what if they decide to have kids and they're bringing those children into that environment? The freedom of the parents would be the ruin of their children. And as freedom and the future are on the side of the latter, we have to take them into account. She says the other is multiple, and on the basis of this, new questions arise. She also has a very interesting discussion, which, is from her time, but we could think about contemporary situations like this, of the political violence that was involved in the Soviet Union on a large scale, right? And she talks about the fallacies of those who simply condemn or justify the violence that is involved. So she says, the opponent of the USSR, when emphasizing the part of criminal violence assumed by Stalinist politics, doesn't confront it with the ends pursued. Purges, deportations, abuses of the occupation, the police dictatorship, they surpass the violences practiced by any other country. Now, she's writing this not knowing what's happening in China, of course, right? The very fact that there are 160 million inhabitants in Russia multiplies the numerical coefficient of the injustices committed. And she says, but we're not measuring just by numbers here. And you can think about the people in the present who are like, Mao was the worst because more deaths there, right, than Hitler or Stalin. And de Beauvoir would say, yeah, that's not the way to go about it. She says, lynching a Negro or suppressing 100 members of the opposition are two analogous acts. Lynching, she says, is an absolute evil. Suppressing the members of an opposition, one might make some justification for that. Probably not a great justification, but there's no justification for lynching. And that's one as opposed to 100, right? So she says that's one way to look at it. You can't just heap up the numbers. The other, the defender of the USSR, is also making use of a fallacy when they unconditionally justify the sacrifices and crimes by the ends pursued. And she says, against the death of Bukharin, one of the people eliminated in the purges, one counters with Stalingrad. But you would have to be able to show how the Moscow trials increased the chances of Russian victory. You can't appeal to necessity. You have to actually make a case that doesn't just appeal to history, necessity, the worker's paradise at the end. And she says, a Marxist must recognize none of his particular decisions involves the revolution in its totality, right? So, both sides are wrong in doing that. We might apply that to people who, unequivocally defend or condemn particular causes in our own present. A bit later, she's going to talk about the anguish of free decision that we face, right? And the fact that we cannot just rely on calculations to resolve problems. She says they must be legitimated concretely if we're going to legitimate the use of violence. A calm mathematical calculation is impossible. It's not that it's impossible. You can do that. You can calculate probabilities. You can say who's affected. You can do things in kind of utilitarian, hedonic calculus manner, but it's not going to resolve your ethical issue, is what she's saying, right? So at some point, you actually have to think about it, and this is the anguish of free decision. So she gives you some examples, from the French Revolution. The Girondists rejected the violence of the terror, whereas the Saint-Just and Robespierre assumed them. Why? They didn't have the same conception of freedom, right? And she says a couple other things here. Situations are typically complex. It's hard to judge them immediately from the outside, the way that a lot of people like to do, both in the present and looking at the past. And we also need to think about the fact that sometimes actions aren't even, like she says, the violence is not immediately efficacious. The violences of the resistance, she's writing about what happened just a few years earlier, did not aim at the material weakening of Germany. The purpose was to create such a state of violence that collaboration would be impossible, right? So she gives you plenty of other examples, including some from American literature that has to do with labor issues and whether to strike, whether to support the party or not. And she contrasts what happens in Steinbeck's novel *In Dubious Battle* with John Dos Passos's *The Adventures of a Young Man*, right? And we could think of other similar political literature. So sometimes the actions are not actually aimed at success of revolt, but just at sustaining revolt. How should we evaluate that? And it's coming back to the same principle. We can't say yes or no immediately. We have to get into the details of the situation. So she is going to, close to the end, talk about ambiguity always reappearing on the scene, right? It's felt by the victim, and his revolt or complaints make it exist for his tyrant. The tyrant will then be tempted to put everything into question, to renounce, denying himself and his ends, or if he persists, will blind himself only by multiplying crimes and perverting his original design more and more. And she points out the fact that those who are contesting violence can also become the new dictators and tyrants. He says, a man gives himself to his cause only by making it his cause. As he fulfills himself within it, it is through him it's expressed, and the will to power is not distinguished in such a case from generosity. When an individual or party chooses to triumph, whatever the cost may be, it becomes their own triumph they take as an end. And she talks about this, legendary fusion of the commissar and the yogi. And she says, well, if that happened, the person of action would be engaged in self-criticism, and they would actually contest the unconditioned value of their goal. They'd be thoughtful about this. That isn't typically what happens. And she says that, the politician follows the line of least resistance. It's easier to kill a man than keep a close watch on him. All politics makes use of the police, which officially flaunts its radical contempt for the individual and which loves violence for its own sake. So she's cautioning us against, if we happen to get power, where we could end up going with it. So existentialism, at least from de Beauvoir's perspective, can't simply rule out violence and say violence is always bad, but it requires that there be attentiveness paid to it, and not to solve it once and then now you've got a free rein, a blank check, so to speak, but that it continually be done. We have to look at the relation between the ends and the means that are being chosen, and that's where existentialist ethics sits on this rather complex matter.